If you've ever been the person in your family who quietly carried the weight, the one who stepped up without being asked, the one who fixed problems before they became disasters, who gave time, money, and energy without expecting applause, then this story may feel unsettlingly familiar. Because sometimes the more dependable you are, the easier it becomes for others to forget that you're human. They stop seeing effort. They stop noticing sacrifice. They begin to assume availability is a permanent trait instead of a choice. My name is Jake, and for a long time I believed loyalty would eventually come back around. I believed that being reliable meant being valued. I believed family kept a kind of moral ledger, even if no one ever spoke about it. What I learned instead is that some families don't keep score at all. They simply take, and when you finally stop giving, they call it betrayal. For most of my adult life, I was the responsible one. Not because I was pressured, not because I was praised, but because responsibility felt like the right thing to do. It was ingrained in me early. If something broke, you fixed it. If someone struggled, you helped. If a problem could be prevented, you didn't wait for it to explode before acting. My parents weren't helpless, but they were overwhelmed by a world that had quietly outpaced them. Technology confused them. Bills piled up faster than they could process. Paperwork became a source of anxiety instead of routine. Small home repairs felt enormous. And every time something went wrong, I was the call they made. Not because I demanded that role, but because I always answered. First it was simple. Advice over the phone. A weekend visit to fix a leaking faucet. Helping them compare insurance plans. Then it became more involved. Driving across town after work to deal with something urgent. Sitting at the kitchen table explaining the same financial concepts over and over because stress erased their memory of the previous explanation. Over time, help turned into support, and support quietly turned into obligation. I helped cover mortgage payments when things were tight. I paid for groceries without making a big deal of it. I handled repairs, paperwork, insurance, taxes. I made sure their lives stayed stable and predictable. I didn't announce it. I didn't keep receipts. I didn't remind them what I was doing. I assumed effort spoke for itself. But effort, I learned, becomes invisible when it's consistent. There was a rhythm to it. A pattern. They would struggle. I would step in. Relief would follow. And then, just as quietly, my involvement would be forgotten. Not erased in a cruel way. Erased in a convenient one. As if my help were just part of the background like electricity or running water. Useful, expected, but not something you thank every day. And because I didn't complain, because I didn't set conditions, because I didn't demand acknowledgement, the line between generosity and entitlement blurred. For them. Not for me. At least not yet. My younger brother Eric lived in a completely different reality. While I was budgeting, fixing, planning, and supporting, he was coasting. Nearing 30, unemployed, no rent, no bills, no urgency. He lived comfortably under the protection of my parents' endless patience. Every excuse was accepted. Every failure was softened. They called him sensitive. They said he struggled with pressure. They said the world was hard on him. And to be fair, Eric wasn't cruel. He wasn't openly malicious. He wasn't plotting. He was something more complicated and, in some ways, more frustrating. He was passive. He avoided discomfort the way some people avoid pain. Whenever life demanded effort, he found a way to step sideways and let someone else absorb the impact. Eric wasn't stupid. He wasn't incapable. He just never learned how to tolerate frustration. Every time something got hard, my parents intervened. They explained it away. They lowered expectations. They softened consequences. And slowly, subtly, they trained him to believe that adulthood was optional. That someone else would always step in. That time would somehow fix what effort did not. I saw it happening in real time, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want conflict. I didn't want to be the harsh brother. I told myself families balance out eventually. I believed responsibility would be rewarded in the long run. Still, cracks appeared long before the truth came out. Small moments. Comments that lingered longer than they should have. My mother would praise Eric for things that barely counted as effort. My father would excuse his failures with a sigh and a shake of the head, as if the world were simply unfair to him. When I succeeded, it was acknowledged briefly and then treated as expected. Of course you handled it, they'd say. That's just you. It was meant as a compliment. Didn't feel like one. Felt like a ceiling. There were nights I drove home from their house feeling heavier than when I arrived. Not angry. Not resentful. Just tired. Tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. Tired of being the one who held things together while pretending it didn't cost anything. But every time I considered pulling back, guilt stepped in. They're getting older, I told myself. They need help. This is what family does. So I kept going. I kept showing up. I kept giving. The belief that responsibility would be recognized cracked open on an ordinary afternoon. There was no thunder. No argument. No warning. My father asked me to help scan some documents. Legal paperwork, financial records, the usual pile of things he didn't want to deal with. I drove over after work, tired but on autopilot. The house felt familiar in the way childhood homes do. Unchanged in all the ways that matter, outdated in all the ways that don't. As I sorted through the stack of papers, organizing them so they could be scanned properly, a folder caught my eye. Thick. Official. Clearly labeled. Estate plan, last will and testament. I paused. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because something about the timing felt off. There had been no discussion. No mention. No conversation about the future beyond vague statements about having things in order. I wasn't looking for inheritance. I wasn't thinking about money. I was tired. And after years of carrying responsibility, it felt reasonable, almost inevitable, to wonder how the future had been planned. How all this effort fit into the larger picture. So I opened it. The moment stretched. Pages turned. Words blurred. And then everything snapped into sharp focus. The house. The savings. The investments. Everything of value had been left to Eric. Not divided. Not shared. Left. Entirely. My name appeared once. Buried in a generic line about loving both sons equally. That single sentence felt colder than being left out entirely. Because equal love doesn't erase one child's existence. Equal love doesn't treat one son as a solution and the other as an afterthought. I didn't feel anger right away. I felt hollow. Like something inside me had gone quiet. I sat there longer than I realized, staring at words that rearranged my understanding of my family in an instant. Years of behavior suddenly made sense. The favoritism. The expectations. The unspoken assumptions. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't last-minute panic planning. This was consistent with everything I had lived but refused to name. When I confronted my parents, I expected surprise, maybe confusion, maybe regret. Instead, I was met with discomfort and dismissal. My father sighed, rubbing his temples, as if I were creating unnecessary stress. My mother avoided my eyes and told me gently that I didn't need inheritance because I was independent. She said it the way people say something they've rehearsed to sound kind. Eric, she said, struggled. They wanted to make sure he was taken care of. Beneath her words was fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of what would happen to Eric if they didn't protect him forever. My father said little. His silence wasn't neutral. It was resigned, as if this decision had been weighed and justified long before I ever saw the paper. In that moment, something became painfully clear. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't temporary. This was a deliberate choice shaped by years of avoidance and misplaced guilt. I wasn't overlooked. I was assigned a role. I was the supporter, not the son they planned to secure. I was the one they trusted to be strong enough not to need anything back. I didn't argue long. There was nothing left to explain. Logic didn't matter. Fairness didn't matter. The narrative had already been written. So instead of fighting, I stopped. I stopped paying. I stopped fixing. I stopped answering calls. For the first time in years, I chose silence. At first, they seemed unbothered. I think they assumed I would cool off and return like I always had. They mistook consistency for obligation. But then the bills arrived. The messages changed. The tone shifted. No concern for how I was doing. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just requests. Expectations. Transactional communication. It became painfully obvious that my value had always been tied to what I provided. When I reminded them that the house was Eric's future, the guilt tactics escalated. They talked about family responsibility, about everything they had done for me growing up, about loyalty, about sacrifice. Eric chimed in too. He wasn't cruel, but he was dismissive. He accused me of being dramatic, immature, obsessed with money. There was defensiveness in his words, but also fear. Because deep down, he knew the safety net he relied on was fraying. Still, the hypocrisy was hard to ignore. It's always just money. When it belongs to someone else. That's when I finally understood something fundamental. People who benefit from unfair systems always call fairness selfish. Blocking their calls didn't end it. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, standing there as if compliance was owed to them. No apology. No self-reflection. Just entitlement. My mother's face carried hurt, but not understanding. My father's carried frustration, not remorse. Eric stood slightly behind them, uncomfortable but silent. That moment stripped away any remaining doubt. This wasn't about reconciliation or love. It was about control. About restoring a system that worked for them. I refused calmly. And instead of guilt, I felt clarity. A deep, steady clarity I hadn't felt in years. When they couldn't reach me privately, they took it public. Social media posts about betrayal, about ungrateful children, about being abandoned in their old age. My parents framed themselves as victims. Eric painted himself as devoted and misunderstood. And suddenly, I was the villain in a story I had spent years funding. I didn't respond immediately. I took time to think. Then I told the truth. Not angrily. Not cruelly. Honestly. I laid out years of support, unequal treatment, and the will that erased me. I explained that love without respect isn't love. It's leverage. The reactions were mixed. Some were angry. Many were understanding. A few were relieved that someone finally said what so many people quietly live through. And for the first time I felt seen. The backlash came quickly, but so did the relief. Because when manipulation loses power, it gets loud. I blocked them all. And something unexpected happened. The weight lifted. No more obligation without respect. No more love with conditions. No more being valued only for what I could give. Walking away wasn't betrayal. Staying would have been. Family isn't just blood. It's balance. Respect isn't optional. Sacrifice should never be rewarded with erasure. I didn't lose a family. I reclaimed myself. And for the first time in my life, I was free to build a future rooted in mutual respect instead of silent obligation. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the dependable one who was quietly taken for granted, understand this. Your role does not define your worth. You are more than what you provide. You are more than the problem solver, the peacemaker, the one who holds everything together. If you're ready to stop being invisible and start being intentional about your life, then you belong here. Join Legacy Feuds, subscribe, and be part of a community that believes self-respect is not selfish, boundaries are not cruelty, and choosing yourself is not abandonment. Because the strongest legacy you can leave behind isn't inheritance. It's identity.